Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Is everybody okay? Everybody had a good lunch? And can I say, all the poster people that have worked through at lunch are rapidly coming down the corridors. So, because we've all just dashed from some really amazing posters. So, we're coming up to our last two sessions. So, firstly, thank you everyone for staying. So that is really fantastic. So I really wanted to introduce the next speaker on purpose, so I thought I'd keep this for myself. I've known Alan Platt for absolute years. When I first started in simulation-based education, he was one of the people that was out there really being very pioneering. I've actually asked Alan to tell you a bit more about himself. He wouldn't normally do this, but I've actually asked him to make a slide about him. But along the way, he's done so much for ASPiH, our UK society. He also has done a lot of work for one of the international societies in Axel. Alan is based up north, as I would call it, up in Newcastle. And I'm really pleased because this year he actually finished his doctorate, and he's done some really innovative ways of actually looking at how people learn through simulation-based education. So it's a great privilege and pleasure for one of my role models in simulation-based education, Dr. Alan Platt.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome post lunch. And thank you, Mandy, for that introduction. Role model. I would say that's the reverse. I've always looked up to Mandy. I think she's a fantastic individual. I am moving on. It's always worth having someone who keeps you in the right track. Can I say your second wife? No. Oh, this is on YouTube. My wife will find that. Sorry, dear. But it's a real privilege to be here. I'm really excited, actually, to be part of a simulation community. I do feel passionate about it. This is Archie Lab, who feels equally passionate about simulation. But what I want to talk about, and I do, as Mandy pointed out, I do find it uncomfortable to talk about myself. But just to give you a bit of a flavour of my background, I'm a critical care nurse by background, and I was appointed into Northumbria University as the simulation lead, primarily to integrate simulation into the undergraduate curricula, so develop a framework from year one right the way through to year three, which accomplished and did quite a lot of work around that whole integration side of things. But then moved into kind of our postgraduate framework and developed simulation within that area, but also do a lot of external work. So I've been involved in simulation for kind of nearly 18 years now, and I've only just calculated that with colleagues just a few weeks ago when we were kind of talking about kind of where we came from. But my beginnings were as a lecturer practitioner in critical care between Northumbria University and Newcastle Hospitals NHS Trust. And that was my first introduction to simulation. We used a lot of standardized patient simulation, developed a recognition of the deteriorating patient at that point. But as a lecturer practitioner, it really grounded me in the development of my kind of educational profile and shape my views, which you will see as we go through. And that's what I want to try and share, just my opinions on kind of simulation and how we develop and how we integrate the theory to practice, hopefully not too radical. As Mandy was saying, I have been heavily involved in ASPiH. I was on the executive board for a number of years, for about 4 years, from about 2010 to 2014. And following that, I was a simulation development officer. And I know there's a number of colleagues in who took on a similar role when we were reviewing nationally what simulation was occurring, so across the piece, really. And more recently, and really privileged to get this, which was an ASPiH fellowship for my contribution to simulation. And it was even more of an honour because it was colleagues who I actually really looked up to, like Bryn Baxton-Dale. Anne was part of this group. So it really meant a lot. But internationally, I have been working with Axel. I was the European Vice President for the chapter of Axel, so the International Nursing Association for Clinical Simulation and Learning, just a small title. But also working with Mandy, did kind of the faculty training as well. So as a member of the international team that we're delivering the Anaxel CE membership program. And more recently, I'm actually part of the national research group looking at the I suppose, a national profile of simulation and developing current standards, etc., for the UK. So it's a reference group with many professionals and organisations involved in that. And again, it's a real privilege to do that. On a more local level, we've got a really tight-knit simulation community in the Northeast. So I'm part of Health Education England North's simulation group, and that kind of helps the direction of where the Northeast is going. A lot of collaborative work coming out of that, but particularly within the Northeast, we run a lot of faculty development programs, and although I'm based at Northumbria, I do contribute to a lot of the programs that are run at a regional level as well. So quite a broad profile in the last 18 years. That's enough about me. So just my thoughts about when Mandy approached me about talking about theory in practice. I was, oh, what? You want me to talk about the what connection? So we did have a bit of chat about it. That's not my dog, by the way. I just found a GIF. But that was my first sense. Oh, actually, what does that mean? Theory to practice. And I fell back towards my old lecturer practitioner role. Best job ever. Sorry, big boss at Northumbria. But the fact that it kind of working in practice, teaching in practice and teaching in the university, I found a fantastic role. And part of that, why I enjoyed it, was I felt I was doing a translation exercise from theory from one organisation or educational theory into a practice setting. And it was how you apply that theory. And conversely, I come from practice and translate clinical knowledge into kind of an educational setting. So that set my framework for this. How am I going to approach this? It's a keynote. Oh, what am I going to say? So this was the model that I kind of had in my head. So this theory, the research behind simulation, clinical practice. We do a bit of simulation that acts as a bridge into critical care. This is kind of one of our sim rooms. We have an immersive suite, and then translate that or apply that into a clinical setting. I thought, great, job done. I've finished. Thank you. But, I will say, this was a bad idea of mine. I was just saying this is a fantastic, I like to keep things simple. It's got 2 buttons, red, green. Press the green one, it will advance the slide. I've just pressed this one. I needed a pointer. Technology. My sim text will not allow me next to any of the kit because I have this tendency to break things. But just going back to that point where I was thinking, well, what is the connection? And attended a regional meeting looking at interprofessional simulation across the Northeast. And it was a really energetic meeting. There was a real buzz to the meeting. Lots of activity. It was actually in a small room, and this is how it felt. Everybody was crammed into this room, so it was really well attended. You had different universities attending, different professional groups, and we were all talking about how we could work together. Simulation was an element of that. There was other aspects of kind of interprofessional learning. I just thought my colleagues had pulled this together. It was a fantastic opportunity. But as we were talking, there was one thing that started to come out, which was highlighted on the agenda where it had university simulation, clinical simulation. I was like, what? And I didn't quite get what they were saying. So 2 separate agenda items talking about the same thing. I was like, well, we're actually talking about interprofessional simulation, and you're talking about university-based and kind of clinical simulation, sim suites or sim centres attached to a hospital, but in a separate entity. And this really got me puzzled. And can I ask, just as a show of hands, who works in a university centre? Who works in a hospital-based sim centre? Well, that's quite good, 50-50. Who does both? Fantastic. Is anyone working purely in situ? As Bryn was talking. the one hand there. And there's a good 50-50 split there. My maths isn't great. But what I thought was actually, what is this split? And I asked the question, and it's kind of that elephant in the room moment. I said, so what's the difference? Can anyone answer? No, it wasn't a question. Well, so what's the difference? And here I've got a couple of slides of projects that I've been involved in. And honestly, just if we're looking at the environment, not necessarily how we're running the sim, which actually was identical. We were using standard, and we kind of bridged the two. But can anybody tell me where they are? Is one a university centre? Is it in situ? No, definitely not. Is one a hospital-based sim centre? So this was me thinking, actually, what are we trying to do? We've got this element. So that's actually one of our sim suites. We've got second-year undergrad nurses doing a recognition of the deteriorating patient. Here we've got our third-year nursing students working with a fifth-year medic, but in a regional-based hospital sim centre. I said, well, there isn't a difference. And the reason we could do this project was we were actually following the same standards. We just merged the two, making it much more efficient. So that was my question to the group. And what one colleague turned around and said, the difference is the number of rooms. That makes a big difference. It does in the amount of simulation. We can run kind of a large number of simulations at the same time. So this really puzzled me. And I was beginning to think, have we kind of misinterpreted what simulation is doing? Are we putting artificial barriers in the way of how we develop? And it made me think about that model where it went from the theory side and a bit of research, using simulation as a bridge or a way of translating into clinical practice. And doing some reflection, I kind of sat myself down, did a little debrief, and asking, after that meeting, what was going on? What was good? What was bad? And I came to actually, what was I actually creating this artificial barrier between the two? Is that actually a difference? So going from that, yes, Mandy, I think I can talk about moving one to the other, but actually I then started questioning myself. So I was left with this issue of what was the connection, and that connection was, despite all of the activities that we've had from nationally, so we've got lots of documents telling us about quality, about standard, about approaches to actually developing good simulation, but also working together, collaborating, using resources. And somewhere along the line, we seem to, in the simulation community, developing lots of wheels. Does anyone else notice that? There's quite a few wheels suddenly appearing. So here we have the TEL document. And what I love about this is that the patient is at the center of the document, educationally coherent, but value for money, equal access. And here you have the latest T framework, which is talking about quality standards, faculty development, the processes to get there. Absolutely fantastic. But what it made me question was actually these wheels, if we're talking still in a separate language, have they fallen off? So I started to think about, well, actually, what do these wheels mean? And what is our interpretation of wheels? We're using technology to get us from one place to another, i.e. taking theoretical knowledge into our clinical side, acting as a bridge. So we're using this, and it made me really think about what, as a simulation community, as a simulation educator, yourselves as simulation educators, what are we actually trying to do? So I had a complete rethink about this connection. What is the connection? I like these fish. It's got nothing to do with the presentation. I just like enough. My daughter's actually, she's studying zoology, and being the doting father, dad, I was talking through an assignment, and one of the assignments was on how kind of animals can live together, or symbiosis, so how they have a symbiotic relationship. So here you have a clownfish that lives within the anemone protects it, anything comes close to it, it will sting it. It doesn't sting the anemone, the clownfish because it has a special coat on. As a simulation educator, I sometimes wish I had that special coat, so you don't get stung. There isn't a link there between the bees and the anemone, by the way. But I did think, well, and the clownfish are actually there. They help protect the anemone, but also clean it. There's food there that they'll take away. So I was starting to think, well, we've got theory. So this is Mr. Theory, that's Mr. Research, and here we have simulation practice, the anemone. Bear with me. And I came up with this term, talking to my daughter about zoology that I know nothing about. I termed this phrase symbiosis. And I just thought, actually, that, bringing all the elements of simulation, as simulation educators, regardless of where we are, what we're doing is merging theory, research, into an element that actually we can deliver, and I think anywhere. So I kind of rapidly went from fish to doing a little model thing. Back. Must have pressed an extra button, sorry. So here in my thinking, I'm very analytical, like things fairly simple. So we've got the theory of simulation, the actual research behind it, which is growing. We've got more and more evidence, but also actually the practice of doing it, how we deliver it, the who, when, why, what. And we've got this kind of symbiotic relationship with it. And if we add to that, please come on, this side where we're starting to draw in other elements to help support our delivery. So when I talk about content experts, to me, I'm not a clinician. I'm not a clinical expert anymore. My expertise lies in education, and particularly simulation-based education. But if I work with somebody who's got that clinical content expertise, whether it's a nurse, a medic, anesthesiologist, ED consultant, we can actually start bringing together a really effective simulation. Add into the equation experts by experience or service users. It adds another dimension and an authenticity to what we're doing. And then you've got actually the participants themselves. So some of the best work I genuinely feel that we've done in the region. I've worked with an emergency department consultant who is actually our regional simulation lead, and an anesthesiologist, a number of individuals who essentially we developed a program as content experts coming together, looking at how we're going to deliver this, and we asked the participants what they wanted from the simulation. So they went out and did a training needs analysis. So they were, in essence, our experts by experience because they're actually mid-level registrars. But you could do that with any profession. So if I'm writing a scenario purely for the university, I always try and get a clinical colleague to do that. And I'm more than happy to say that I'm not a clinical expert anymore. But with all of that, we can deliver that anywhere. So that artificial barrier that I had in my head about moving theory to practice, using simulation as that link to get into practice, actually doesn't matter if it's a university centre or if it's a hospital-based centre, or even in situ. And Bryn was talking about frameworks for in situ. They're always based on best practice, and you go through that symbiotic relationship to build those, working in multi-professional groups. So I've copyrighted this, suddenly patent, I've just I don't know, but it does make a big difference in how we deliver. So I went from seeing it as a separate entity delivered in separate areas to actually, as a community, if we start working together collaboratively, we include individuals, we're much stronger together. And the weight of evidence about the research, how we deliver, actually brings in a whole new dimension to kind of the weight that we can push forward. So I was really sort of kind of had this mind shift over the last 3-4 months after speaking to Mandy about where and how and what we do as simulation educators and working together. And naturally, being an lecturer practitioner, I've always tried to collaborate. And I think, looking at the UK national agenda in terms of Health Education England and the framework. It's all about quality provision, working together, collaborating. So we often will share faculty across the region, we'll share resources across the region, and we will ask colleagues in payment back to come in. So I deliver a 1 to 3 week international faculty development program, and often get my colleagues to come in because I've been to their sim centres and helped sort of deliver programs there. So it had this huge cultural shift, really. So I think as simulation educators, simulationists, if you look at the dictionary, we're in a really unique position. And I think we can transcend boundaries, completely overrun this if we work together. And I think, what the future for me in terms of kind of the overarching strategy is simulation without walls. And anybody who in the UK was involved in critical care and outreach, there was that term, wasn't there? Critical care without walls. Yeah, let's talk about, I forgot I'm on the television, YouTube. My kids would be, Dad's dancing. But I really like the idea of actually we shouldn't have boundaries there. We should be working together. And hopefully you kind of bear with me on that one. So what I want to do is just talk about some of my research and also some of my experiences about how that actually fits together. So as a simulation educator, how do we do this? We're going to kind of talk a bit of safety. And again, Bryn brought some elements into that, as well as educational outcomes. And Terry this morning kind of really pushed educational outcomes. We do them really badly, and what was the bottom line, I think. So actually, I'm going to raise that in one of my slides. So I was thinking, well, actually, we've got this education research and a symbiotic relationship with everything else. So if we look at kind of one of the things that we're aiming for is to achieve good educational outcomes for our participants. Well, we know. So I think of Kirkpatrick. And on the same side, we should be translating a lot of the research we're doing in simulation to get level 3, tier 3 better patient outcomes, which really fits really nicely with the TEL wheel, the technology enhanced learning wheel, with a patient at the center. But to me, there's a crucial element missing in this symbiotic relationship that I've just made up, and it's this person. Who are we actually training? Who's our trainees? Who's our students? And it's the participant. So if you start changing a lot of the patient safety elements that we talk about in delivery, so if we change it to participants, so at the top here we've got patient-centered. Well, actually, we talk about educational-centered, about the student being the center of our education. Should we have participant there? And all of this starts to make sense in a very different approach. So my thing is actually we should be turning this on its head. It's really laudable, and we need to do the patient. That's what we're here for. To me, even I'm university-based now, the ultimate aim is to improve patient safety. But what I want to do is anybody coming through Sim Centre comes into my any sessions is that they get a good educational outcome, and the research supports that, but they're supported in the journey. And if why I'm pushing this in terms of support is that when a participant knocks on the door and say, please let me in, can I do some sim with you? They're putting a huge amount of trust in this. And when it kind of linking to the patient safety agenda, if they're kind of putting trust in us that we're going to essentially keep them safe, if you look at this is from the recent departmental health document, and there's just a couple of elements that I want to point to. It's got never events. Well, actually, is there never events for a simulation? When things go wrong, you don't get a pre-brief, the debriefing becomes a nightmare, and it becomes one-directional and point fingers. You should be sacked, Alan Sugar approach. But it also mentions about rehearsal of skills, checklists, and completed approach to, I suppose, training programs. But the other side of it is understanding the messy detail of what's happening in practice. But change that to the participant, and as a sim educator, it puts a different context onto it. And putting all that together, press the right button, this trust element, the participants come in, and they're expecting an uncomfortable experience, to say the least, but we talk about a safe learning environment, yet they're actually taking a leap of faith with this, not necessarily in that manner, but they are taking a leap of faith to trust that we've actually set that up educationally so they get a good learning experience, but actually from a safety point of view, that they get an experience that actually they feel comfortable with. And Bryn yesterday really hit home about when you're taking, I suppose, never events or critical incidents and rerunning them for the rest of the hospital. What impact does that have on the individuals that occurred to? Because the other will probably know who they are. And about what's the safety element of running these when you've had a major incident in a trust. What happens at a local level when you're running the simulation? So really, again, this whole element of being safe with our participants. And I genuinely think we can design simulations, the instructional design features, to actually promote safety. So it helps with the learning and actual participant safety. So when things do go wrong, that framework that you've done, you've used the ASPiH standards, I'm saying that because Anne's sitting there, or the ANACSL standard, again, slight challenge on that one. So I think, well, actually, what can promote learning and promote safety? And I don't know if anyone else has had kind of people through the Sim Centre, and this is what it looks like. So it's OSCE Day. Or you've got a big sim training in where you're running 6 multi-professional simulations at the same time. You can't find your sim tech because they've collapsed somewhere. But generally, the whole place is swamped. I think, how on earth am I going to deliver an authentic, immersive simulation to 300 plus participants? I can see everybody going, oh. We've all been there. So one of the things that has really interested me, and this is kind of linking the symbiotic element of the theory, was Erickson's deliberate practice, where you can work through, if you've got specified goals that are set at the learner's level, you can motivate them to kind of continue to develop under the expert guidance of a coach. And you see this with chess players, sort of 10,000 hours of deliberate practice where they go and practice moves. You see it with musicians where they start off with a small element of a whole concerto, and then they gradually build up and build up and build up, and then they become an international expert. I'm not saying that we become an international expert, but that's kind of that whole process. So it really interested me where this could take. My sticking point was that the fact it was individual. So people talk about individual skills, and there's no other kind of broadening of this. So when I've got 300 students, I think, actually, I can't use this framework. I think it's a fantastic framework. I think there's elements kind of towards that will work, but how? And again, you get inspiration from the strangest areas. You may think, Newcastle United? Really? Alan, what you do? But my son and myself used to go regularly with season ticket holders. And a few years ago, when I was kind of looking at this, we went to a match. It was with Manchester United. And as you can guess, we've been beat. By half-time, we were 3-0 down, something like that. And you can imagine the language on the terrace about Newcastle United being 3-0 down to Manchester United. And, to paraphrase, there was, have these people ever trained together? Quote, unquote. Others with, it's a team of individuals. Sitting there. So in the midst of this all this kind of banter, this going backwards and forwards. And I was thinking, really? Left, went back with her son. And then it dawned on me, actually, these guys are talking about a team of individuals. What happens on the training pitch? Who's the coach? And I say, actually, some of that reflects deliberate practice? Some of the things that they were saying, do they ever train together? So I started to look at this, and this is a simulation we were doing with the deanery. It's ED department, emergency admission, meningococcal baby, and we've got a range of individuals in there. We've got a senior nurse, we've got an F2 doc, and then the two people in the middle, I can't actually see from here, are mid-level registrars. One's paediatrics and one was ED. And the scenario was designed to unpick the communication between the two registrars. But while we were actually doing this, I thought, actually, you've got these individuals and they're training together. So they've developed that in terms of Erickson's framework, that expertise, that we're using deliberate practice. But here we're putting them into an environment where they can practice as a team. So they bring their individual expertise to a multi-professional simulation. Wish Newcastle could do that, but no. But it did make me think, so I started exploring some of the literature around teams, and there's this term, team deliberate practice, where you get individuals who are experts in terms of football, put them onto a training pitch to do coaching sessions. So under the expert guidance of a coach, you do team deliberate practice. So it's a rehearsal of that. And one of the elements was, how do you put a team in? Because deliberate practice is partly taking on responsibility for your learning. And because we're flush with money, we allow our students just to come in and use our mannequins. No problem at all. They just book it in. Don't need to train them how to do the sim tech. It's great. Live in cloud cuckoo land. But it's a lot of resource to do that. So I start looking at, well, is there some way of delivering this? And I came up with this model, and this is, as Mandy was saying, this is what I looked at in terms of my doctorate, but a new way of delivery. And I used an approach where I compared this model with the traditional simulation. So classically, what do we all do? We do a pre-brief, do your learning outcomes, introduction, roles, etc., confidentiality, run a scenario, and again, authentic replication, and then using a debriefing model, undertook the debriefing. And that's kind of what we all do. I still do that now. But what I wanted to add was that element of that football kind of culture where you do a bit of coaching. They can't access our patient simulators, so we can control that. And in a 3-hour slot where we'd run for around about 30 students, 4 simulations, we get that model into the same set of a 3 hours period. So what I added was this coached walkthrough. So after the debrief, when they've kind of talked about application and their learning outcomes, what they're going to do, my colleagues who are the facilitators would actually take them back into the same room, same sim room, and then just talk through the learning outcomes, but in a process. So because we're doing recognition of deteriorating patient, it was like A, B, C, D, E. That was the structure, but anything particular. So it was a coached walkthrough. And then after that, we actually took them in and reran the scenario. So in the same time frame, exactly the same scenario. And I don't know if anyone else has had this. When students have finished, they're, I would like to do that again. The odd one. You might have everybody else is running for the door. But there was students coming up and said, I would like to do that again. When's the next session? Could we have more? So this was, to me, a way of capturing that essence of doing more, but in a structured framework. They were still coached, still met all the deliberate practice. So they repeated this scenario, and then they had a shorter debrief kind of evaluation. So I thought, yeah, great, fantastic. Research head on, let's do some work on this. So I did research this. I looked at the actual performance on the video capture, and the green line is actually the intervention, so that whole framework, sim with team deliberate practice. And as you can see, it's much higher in terms of this group. So the traditional sim guys, their performance wasn't quite as good. And because I followed this group of students over a year, I actually got, over time, a statistically significant effect. Yes. Thought, doctorate done. Yeah, move on. So actually, I was quite pleased with the result. But I don't know if anyone's noticed the last two. So these were 3 monthly intervals. There was no statistical significant difference between the two areas. But when I looked at the end, I kind of had a bit of a meltdown, genuinely. Because here, both groups, this group was up here, this group was up here, and they're down here. So was there something wrong with my model? So you kind of go, oh, okay. So I went from being up here, because all you see is a p-value. That doesn't mean anything. That's all p. Yeah. And then sort of realising it's like, oh, that's 5 years. Oh, disappeared. How do I explain this to my wife that it's failed and I've got to do my doctorate again? So it was really kind of a challenge, and I was pondering this for some time. And it dawned on me one day, that may look suspiciously like a car park. And this is my car parking space. I remember coming in to work one day. I had a supervisory meeting later on that day to discuss the results. And to come in, I had some teaching sessions in the morning, so flew in for Newcastle. The roads were really busy. There were 6 cars on the road. That was a nightmare. You can imagine the scene, can't you? 6 cars. So I got into work. I was slightly frazzled. Dumped the car, ran into my office. And then I got a phone call from the receptionist saying, Alan, security's on the phone. I think, I didn't speed. There's a barrier. I come through the barrier. And she said, I'll put you on. So I spoke to the security guard and he said, can you come and move your car? I went, why? He said, you parked in the wrong bay. And I went, no, I'm not. He said, you parked in the wrong bay. And I went, I'm not. I'm parked in 79. And he went, you're not. You're parked in 80. And I went, no, I'm not. I thought, I haven't got time for this. I've got to go into class. And he said, you're going to have to move your car. There's a colleague waiting to come in. We get clamped and everything if we don't. So I went down, full of, like, I'm in the right bay. And when I got down there, my battered old Igo was in 80. And honestly, my first thought was, who's put my car? Who's moved the car from there to here? And then I thought, there's a camera somewhere. Somebody set me up. And he said, you're going to have to move it. And I was like, must be someone looking at it. And then it dawned on me that actually I had parked in the wrong bay. There's no way there because it was too short a time. And what I'd missed as I came in, there's a big brick pillar behind. I had looked in my rearview mirror. Otherwise, it hit the wall. Missed that. Normally, I'd have a green metal bar. Missed the number completely. So when I looked out and got out the car, walked past 79. What's that about? And I had, lots of things going on, family-wise. Kind of, if you, the daughter hadn't been well, and all of this. So in terms of kind of my thinking, I think it was kind of my bucket was full in terms of kind of human factors. And the one thing that I can think of that made me park in 80 was normally I have a colleague who had another silver car, and I just would pull in and go in, kind of get into that routine habit. But one of my colleagues, how dare they buy a new car that was silver and parked opposite here? So when I came in, I just pulled into behind the first silver car and reversed in and was in 80. And I thought, I was still kind of went into class and came out. And I had to meet my supervisor, and I was thinking, well, what is going on? And I just genuinely felt that it was kind of an overload thing. The evaluations for my teaching sessions were okay, I have to say. But it did make me think about this result, and I was chatting to my supervisor, and she's not healthcare background, she was a scientist by background. And she said, I've read a paper about this in education, about cognitive load theory. I thought, oh, that's nice. Yeah. Well, I'm talking healthcare. Come on. And the more I thought about it, and I actually read the paper about cognitive load theory, and it made perfect sense. These groups, actually, we had a really strict protocol. learning objectives were really clear. In this group, they actually, when I went back to look at the scenarios, the learning outcomes, it said exposure to ALS algorithms. Bear in mind, these were second-year nursing students. So I was looking at the scenario. It was actually an add-on that we kind of worked through, so we would demonstrate these algorithms. But actually, in putting that in, I put my hand up, I got it wrong. Actually, I felt I'd overloaded them, and the scenario actually was at the wrong level. But we only put it in, I kind of facilitated that, because that's what the learning outcomes said. Alan, you must stick to your learning outcomes. This is the program, these are the module ones, and this is your session. The NMC states. I'll not mention Alex here, Alex. It's a whole competency thing for nurses, so apologies to my medical colleagues. But yeah, I'd actually got the scenario level completely wrong. So I didn't pick that up until here. So it's something about safety there. Actually, had I hindered that group's learning because I hadn't designed my simulation effectively for their level. And so we don't actually think kind of, I can do a simulator, I can switch it on. Yeah, oh, yeah, let's just put everybody in. And then somebody says, Alan, when are we meant to stop? And you haven't got an end point, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And then says, well, the 10th round of kind of resuscitation, we've been through the algorithm 4 times. Should we stop? Oh, we haven't met the learning outcome. What is it? We design these things, we just put them in, but we really need sound instructional design to enhance learning but protect the students. We want them to learn. We want our participants to learn. So that was a real eye-opener for myself in terms of that. So really, in terms of human factors, I genuinely overloaded them. We talk about, kind of working memory. You can, at the best of times, you can have 7 elements going on. Just put a bit of emotion in that. Put being a man in that. It just goes to none, doesn't it? But essentially, if you tend to take the human factors element and kind of relate that in a symbiotic manner, it actually does make sense in terms of learning. And it's not something that I'd ever thought about until my little IGO turned up in the wrong parking bay. Strange experiences. So moving on, kind of thinking about that document, the kind of patient safety side, about making it efficient and etc. We talked about standards, the ANACSA standards, the ASPiH standards, and everybody talks about having standardized templates. I was talking to Gary from Iris about, all this being online. But actually, when you're really busy and you're doing lots of simulation, you kind of go into a pre-brief and you think, oh, did I say that to this group? Did I talk about confidentiality? Oh, we've got an AV system, and please be careful what you say. And you lose track of what you're doing. And again, we need to protect not just the participants, but ourselves in some respects. So I'm a real advocate of having checklists. And again, it's like that patient safety culture. So I'm talking, we've got a participant culture here about protecting them and ourselves. And I use this in our faculty development programs, the 1 or 2 day ones, when you're trying to make it interactive and you want people to plan, rehearse, and do a simulation that we can then debrief them on after they've debriefed it. These work great, and use it particularly for the international colleagues who come over, and to get them into the swing of that whole process. Again, you can talk novice to expert, but to me, it's just a simple tool that will actually help in the delivery. So, great advocate of checklists. Now, thinking of safety, we've all talked about creating a safe learning environment, and again, this is in the document. Form safe experiential learning to allow people to fail safely. And would you all agree that's kind of really what we're trying to do? And yes, we can talk about how debriefing works and, advocacy inquiry, in Jenny Rudolph's work, about debriefing with good judgment and trying to unpick what's in their head. And I think that's, a fantastic approach. That's not what I'm kind of highlighting here, though. Going back to my results, I had this little IGO moment. What have I done there? And then I start to unpick my results further, and just in this bottom corner, the comparison group, who were just doing the traditional simulation, pre-brief, scenario, debrief, actually found when the performance was at its lowest, the confidence levels were at the highest. So here I had a group who undertook the intervention, who actually, their scores were really good. Observation, had integrated reliability, had a number of people observing, we kind of merged the scores. But in these groups, the performance was much lower. But these guys actually had a statistically significant confidence rate. The only time ever. And I was like, oh. And it was one of those unexpected findings. So I put these guys through a simulation, and at the end of it, they were feeling really confident. So it made a question, had I created an element of overconfidence? So bearing in mind these are fairly novice, second year, coming to the end of their second year, so they're about to go into their third year. You know, and these were the scenarios that had overloaded them as well, but they were still feeling, yeah, I'm good, I can do this, bring it on. So it made me think, you know, you've got some individuals who, in terms of this symbiotic relationship, are kind of milling around in the sea, going, yeah, I get this, I'm reflecting on it. And then out of nowhere, somebody just comes out and goes flying past. Yeah, bring it on. So in terms of safety, have we actually created a safe environment for these guys where potentially, and I'm not saying that I need to explore this, and it's an area that I would like to explore as well. Have we created an overconfidence? So actually putting them through repeated simulations, is kind of, they had quite a lot in that, was creating this individual or individuals who actually didn't quite get where they were at. And we can talk about unconscious incompetence, but it was, again, it was one of those little highlighting moments. So it'd be an area to actually explore as a simulation community, to say, you know, what are we actually doing? So that's kind of where essentially it was. So, you know, if we get it right, this is going back to my dog who gets excited when you mention the word simulation. So this is Archie at the beach, and he's been practicing catching the ball. And I just thought, you know, what else is there within my research where we can practice? The model appeared to work, statistically significant. There was some glitches, but as a sim educator, it was my fault. I got them wrong. So there was other elements that came out, and when I plotted just the scores of each group, without, and I'd say there wasn't statistically significant, there was a number of elements that came out. So the grey line is the intervention, who did the the simulation with team deliberate practice, and the red line is the standard group. And you notice it's dipping down, but that was me with poor design of a scenario. But with doing this over a 3-month period, so these were the blocks when they were out in clinical placement, come back, and then they do the simulation and go out, and it was repeated on that cycle. But there's some interesting findings that the actual scores did go up. Although it wasn't statistically significant, the size effect was good, which I tend to take from an educational intervention is good. There wasn't a good p-value. But educationally, I think we've got to sometimes question, is it what does that actually mean? And there's a lot of discussion about p-values at the moment. But notice actually, if we go down, their scores dropped to the baseline of the previous group. So they had this kind of accelerated learning, and then 3 months later, they dipped down to where the traditional group was. And part of my thinking was, actually, I've got this wrong. Is it more cost effective to do the red line approach and continue on with SIM? But I was reading around the literature. I come across this study by Chatham, who looked at kind of the Top Gun pilots, so the Tom Cruises of the world, you know. So comparison there. So you had Tom Cruise going around doing this elite fighter training. So you had these guys who were really expert. But what they found was they were doing their training in 3 monthly batches, very similar. And lo and behold, that they would have this accelerated learning curve, but actually then it would dip down to the baseline. So what I found in my study was actually what I found in the kind of fighter pilot thing. So you kind of have this accelerated effect. So kind of think, it's like this whole symbiotic relationship. We kind of talk, and at simulation, we look at medicine management and errors, and why did you give this amount of adrenaline when actually this is the dose, and you get kind of that whole overload thing. And I started thinking, actually, when you're talking about medicines generally, we do talk about a therapeutic dose. As a simulation educator, we talk about competence. What do we want our participants to achieve? So it got me thinking, well, actually, I had an accelerated curve. So what's the loading dose? So if you give a drug, you give it to get above that therapeutic level, get above the competence level. So I was thinking, actually, did my model help raise those students, but I didn't give them a maintenance dose to keep them above that level? So here I've got a nice loading dose. See, this is technology. Note, I've been a lecturer for a number of years. My PowerPoint's out of sync. So not only I can't park a car, I can't actually work PowerPoint. But the whole idea of that loading dose, you give it as a bolus, brings a level above a level of competence, and then what do we do here in terms of a maintenance dose? What's the interval? And genuinely, I don't know. Again, it's something that we need to look at as a simulation community. But there's a lot in education about distributed practice, not distributed as in doing simulation out and about, but actually what the spacing levels are. And there's work out there that said if you've got a test, you kind of look at a percentage beforehand. So if you're doing a test within kind of 3 to 4 weeks, you should do kind of a simulation roughly within sort of the first 2-week period to actually improve. I don't know how effective that is. That's from education and kids. I don't know how that would work in kind of a simulation environment, but it certainly picked up some elements from my perspective about how we work as simulation educators in a symbiotic manner, because I think everything that I've talked about would work in a university setting, which is where it was originally designed, but it would work in a sim center attached to, I suppose you've got lots of people coming in. Could we use the Team D deliberate practice model? What is the loading dose, and do we have a program to come further down? And I do think it would work in situ. Bryn was talking about a framework of delivery and what's best practice. That would actually work in practice. You hear about rapid cycle simulation doing BLS and kind of short, sharp doses, but actually you could do that with the team. So this is where my thinking is completely changed. Actually, what we're doing in practice in terms of the clinical areas or any environment in universities, we should be sharing more. It's that symbiosis. So these are the kind of key points of kind of thinking about that symbiosis between everything. It's about collaboration, working together, sharing ideas, but breaking that wall down. That simulation without walls is what I'm really kind of driving. If you replace patient safety with participant safety when we read the documents, all of that impacts on how we deliver education. It could be a lecture theatre, and you've got the tier at the back who's completely asleep, but actually that whole process works, and it's about kind of changing our culture and how we deliver. But I think part of that is through instructional design. So let's say thank you from Archie, not me, Archie. And essentially, any questions? And that's me. But thank you very much for bearing with me. Thank you. I'm not quick enough. Sorry, I can't.
That's right, a microphone. Oh, it's on now. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. One of the things you asked was, what's the difference between simulation attached to a hospital versus simulation attached to a university? And the word I wrote here was the facilitators.
Ah, yeah.
So
I agree. Yeah.
Who was facilitating? And then the next thing you talked about is trust. And do the students have trust in who's facilitating them in a university versus who's facilitating them in the hospital? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Actually, it's a really good point. And this goes back to for me, it's about how we are trained as a simulation educator. I know there's the issue about credibility, and I've said I don't see myself as a clinical expert, and that's because, you know, it's very rarely I can get into practice now and the way everything works. But I've still got a clinical background, so I understand when a clinical colleague or a content expert comes to work with me to develop a scenario. So when we do run simulation, I think the art of it's about good faculty development, and that's why I always go back. It said if I'm developing a simulation, I always go back to a clinical colleague to get them to review it. And I'm not out of touch. That's what I wasn't saying. I just don't like the term expert when I'm saying clinically. So I have got that understanding. But I think it's down to training. And a lot of people, as soon as you say, well, let's do some faculty training, everybody runs. And especially if you're going to put people on the spot, and it is key. But actually, when I've been working across kind of a university-based simulation centre and a practice-based one, actually we're debriefing in the same way, we're following the same models, and we're approaching it. And I've learned a huge amount from colleagues who are more clinically based than I am, and they're vice versa. And I think that's where that symbiosis comes from, so we can learn together. But actually that gives me more confidence in the clinical side as well. And I think there's so many more elements that I haven't picked up there about working together. And this is a qualified postgraduate level, that most of it. An undergraduate can see it would work exactly the same. I have colleagues that use in their simulations, they work with somebody who's current clinically. But I get it, and it's how we train. I sometimes get, well, that's elitist if you talk about simulation. I think it was in one of the sessions yesterday. I think it was in Anne's session. We talked about kind of the development NOSCIs. But I think partly for me is that we should all, as a sim educator, be on the other side. We should be the guy with the bungee cord on the bridge, hanging on to that poor girl and jumping off. We should actually be taking that leap of faith, because I think it's the only way we can learn and how that simulation goes. And that is actually quite a challenge to do that. Most people would want to run away and say, well, I'm all right on this side. I'm behind that glass and I can just see you. Or the actual, we'll just do it as a script and talk about it. So I think there's a key element about, again, going back to culture, thinking about what we do patient safety-wise, actually turning it round on its head. To get to that level, we need to be participant safe as well, and ourselves. Got to have time for ourselves.
Oh, Marina, come in. Oh. No, because we have microphones we will use.
Hi, Alan. Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you. I've been really nervous, actually.
I'm doing some research myself on the confidence and